Femboys. It's probably a word you've heard if you access the internet. That is, of course, if you don't have a crush, or even worse, if you are one of them. Even though current society values the subversion of stereotypes and gender, it is contradictory to see how men who dress and have stereotypically feminine and women's behaviors tend to use this to attract other men, not women. The same goes for many heterosexual people. Although many couples value the subversion, the famous heteronormativity still seems to exist, where there is a passive partner with feminine qualities and an active one with masculine qualities. And even though I've made some videos on the subject, a question that lingers is, why does this happen? And more specifically, why do men seem to adopt these more than women? Like, why don't we have as many women tomboys, or even have this as some sort of fetish, just like femboys seem to be? And yes, although these women-like tomboys do exist, when we look at women who really try to subvert social expectations, we find not women with masculine behaviors, but rather with behaviors that are anti what is typically seen as feminine, such as long hair, depilation, clothing and dresses, delicate and polite behaviors. Of course, not all women are like this, just as not all men are fans of soccer and the gym, but when it comes to subverting social expectations, men do not seem to adopt sedentary, thinness, or obesity behaviors. In fact, it is likely that most men are likely like this. Like, you have to train yourself to get a body like PewDiePie, I don't know. What happens when men try to really subvert expectations is precisely this act of imitating women and being more feminine, while women themselves try to subvert by not having that same very femininity in many times. And the question here is simple: why does this happen? And one of the hypotheses for this is simple: competition. In one of the last videos I've made, I commented on whether men are natural providers or not. And I talk about how for the last 500 million years we have been adapted to have one sex that seeks things and another that manages and stores them. And how sexual selection, for example, shows how there are characteristics in both men and women that are more or less valued in one another. At the same time, Charles Darwin, in The Origin of the Species, talks about how the sexes can sometimes compete among themselves. That is, if men are valued by women for collecting resources, for example, those who do it better than other men are more selected by those very same women. And women who manage these resources better, let's say, are also more valued or receive the best, to given the best resources in comparison. By way of example, just in a hypothetical case, if a man values himself, is hardworking, or is good at talking, he will want a woman who recognizes those characteristics and values him for them. And if a woman is good at being pleasant, kind, understanding, and beautiful, she will want a man who recognizes these characteristics in her. It's like reinforcement from the behaviorists. Those are characteristics that this person has and wants to give to the other person. So a person who recognizes this, of course, will be valued for such. Having said that, here is my theory. What if men and women who deviate from these patterns are not actually escaping the patterns themselves, but rather the competitiveness that arises from them? What do I mean by this? If you are a man and you need to compete with other men to collect resources, to gain steam, what would happen if you started taking these resources for yourself instead of needing to fight with other men to get them? Isn't that much better and easier than trying to be better than them and what they themselves do? Rather than risking yourself, your life, not only your resources that you have already accumulated, but also this capacity to achieve more. And in the case of women, If you are unable to attract someone who can provide the best things you want, why not do it yourself and become one of those empowered women who don't need any man in their life? Isn't that much better than needing to admit your own inadequacy? Something interesting is that Freud himself in psychoanalysis already said very similar things. He called this tendency for men to stop trying to be better or even to become stagnant when faced with other better men or with other men altogether, the castration complex. Due to the literal fear of losing the phallus itself, that thing which supposedly symbolizes this capacity to go there, to try, to succeed, to expose yourself, just like the phallus is exposed himself. And that's why, in his view, these men became less masculine, less courageous, and without much will. While in women, he called this tendency to sometimes want to imitate men, to want to do what other men do, and to, give this pleasure to themselves as the penis envy, because that way they don't need any man. They don't need to communicate. They don't need to say what they want, and they don't need to give even what would be necessary to achieve those things for that they themselves want. To summarize, what if those people that trying to subvert expectations, the femboy man or the radical feminist woman, they all are like this, not because they don't want, the opposite sex, because they don't like it either, but rather because they fear so much what they have to give. In the case of men, we have to compete with other men. And in case of women, well, sometimes they have to give up things and to give those expectations, those things, and to say their desires to other men. And this can also make them vulnerable. Men can be killed while trying to compete with other men, and women can sometimes also risk their lives when exposing themselves so much. There are so many things, pregnancy, diseases, and so on. But in the end of the day, isn't this just, a lack of courage, or just living in fear without admitting the things you really want in your life? And if you are incapable of saying the things you want, to going after those things, what kind of life will you be living in the next 10, 20, or even for the rest of your days? Is it really the sort of life you want? And if it isn't, well, what can you do, if you're a man, to go out there, to admit your desire, to use your phallus to destroy this castration complex, to compete with other men and go after the woman you want? And if you are a woman, what do you need to give, to talk? What are your desires? And how can you, negotiate to achieve this with other men, with people, with the people you desire, That's it. That's it. This is the only question. This is just a rambling of my thoughts. Tell me in the comments what you think about this, if you agree, if you disagree, if it makes some sense, if it doesn't. If you are interested in a consultation with me, I'm a clinical psychologist in Brazil. You can check the link in the description and book a session with me. My name is Julio Cesar, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.